Hello guys, and welcome to the 7th and last Hymal Mythic guide. Throughout this whole journey, I've always had Justwait with me. Hello Justwait.
Hello everyone again.
We're gonna be talking about Margok. We finally reached the last boss, and boy, it's a big one. He has 4 phases and 2 intermissions. Well, technically Margok has 3 phases and 2 intermissions, and then we have a little surprise for the end.
Even if this is the last fight, this fight is not about how much DPS the raid can pull out, and it's more about how long can the raid stay alive and not die from the boss's abilities. Because this, we're gonna run with 5 healers to keep the whole raid alive and going, and we're gonna use 3 tanks to handle all the ads that are going to be spawning throughout the whole fight.
Now in terms of classes, because of the Mark of Chaos, you want one of your tanks at least to be able to blink or run away fast. So the ideal classes for that is either a warrior or a monk, and you can still use a druid. It also works, but it's not optimal.
For the DPS classes, it doesn't really matter that much what you bring, but you want to have enough interrupts for the intermission phases to interrupt the war mages, and also some classes to keep up the AoE in the 3rd phase to kill the arcane remnants.
Alright, so in terms of differences from Heroic mode to Mythic, the biggest difference is that the boss will have 2 runes empowering him at a time instead of 1 that was in Heroic, which means that his abilities will actually do extra effects in each phase. Now the other big difference is that unlike in Heroic mode where the boss gains his first rune at 85%, the boss in Mythic starts having 2 runes. And the first intermission is at 66% instead of 55%, and the second intermission is at 33% instead of 25%. As you can see, you just have 3 big phases starting from 100%, and each phase has 33% of health.
There's also a minor change happening in the intermission phases for Mythic, which will be that when the war mages actually get a successful cast off, they will buff themselves, so you want to interrupt that. And the last and the biggest change for Mythic will be the new phase that will start at 5%.
Which we'll explain later. So starting with phase 1, as we said, the boss will have 2 runes, and the runes for the first phase are the Rune of Displacement and the Rune of Replication. Now what that means for the abilities that the boss casts, the Force Nova will do the pushback and also have the pulses, the small explosions around you when you're going through it that hit the players next to you. The Arcane Wrath will have the circle around you, which means you can't move freely with it, and also, first time it expires, it will jump to 2 players instead of just 1. The Mark of Chaos, the tank debuff, will teleport the tank to a ranged player, but also spawn orbs when it expires that will move around the room and kill anyone who touches them. And the Arcane Aberration will spawn small adds when it's dying, and also knock back everyone from the raid when it actually dies. And lastly, of course, we have the Destructive Resonance, which will just call traps for the rest of the guide. And those traps will grow bigger as time passes, and once they expire, once they go away, they will actually spawn 2 new ones next to them, instead of just vanishing.
Now in terms of execution for phase 1, we're gonna use these world markers that we've used in the video, and there's also an image in the written guide displayed for that, so if you want to use our world markers you may, and we're going to be using those as a reference in this video from now on. The raid will start on the triangle, which is the ranged, and the melee will just be sitting on the boss, which will be positioned right as he lands on the ground. No need to move him anywhere. As a good rule of thumb for the tanks is to always face the boss towards the ranged. This is to have the arcane apparitions that spawn always spawn in front of the boss, so they will be closer to the ranged and they will have the range to DPS it from the start, as it's important to always damage those first. Now as the traps are spawning on the ranged, they will move counterclockwise from the triangle, which is where they started, towards the diamond, then the cross, then the skull, until they reach the square, and by that time usually the phase is already over. As they are moving towards that way, the boss will be dragged a little bit with them towards the center of the room, so it doesn't stay all the way near the triangle.
Now in terms of the boss abilities and how you handle them, the Force Nova should be casted only 3 times, unless your DPS is either absolutely insane or really shit. And because the whole ranged camp is going to be gathered up, and there are pulses happening when you go past them, what you want to do is use all the blinks that you have, so pick the talents like the Druid blink, and the mages have blink, and the warlocks can leap forward, so all of those are good to use. and you can also use immunities to run past them, like Divine Shield or Deterrence. So try to use all of them because you don't want everyone exploding on top of everyone else. And as a last thing you can do, you can have assigned people that go in first, so they move forward as soon as the Force Nova comes, and some other people staying a bit more backwards and running in after the first wave of people have went past it. And obviously have a small spread around. Moving on to the Arcane Wraths, it's pretty simple to handle them in this phase. If the initial target of the Arcane Wrath is a melee, then you keep it in the melee camp. As we said, it's going to jump to 2 players, and once its jump distance is 13 yards only, then the rest of the melees who don't have the debuff need to actually move on the opposite side of the boss just to outrange it. Keep in mind that the tanks cannot get it, so don't fear that it will. Now, if it happens to spawn in the ranged camp, just like we did in the melee camp, you don't have to move too far away, but you do need to have 4 assigned players, ideally hunters and healers, that slowly take the debuff and move away from the ranged camp to the left side of them. And when it reaches 25 yards jump range, you just get rid of it. The 2 people who have it stay there, and the other 2 join the rest of the ranged camp.
For tanks, phase 1 is not that complicated, because all they're going to be doing is tanking the ad, which, since you have 3 tanks, you will just assign 1 tank to handle the Arcane Apparition and the small ads when it dies. Just tank them on top of the boss, and that's it. They will get cleaved down by the DPS. For the Mark of Chaos, the other 2 tanks will be handling both the boss and the Mark of Chaos. And since the boss still gets the stacks and increases his damage and attack speed every time he hits, you're going to want to swap around 5-6 tanks. And when there's 8 seconds left to Mark of Chaos, you want to do 1 more tank swap. And then the boss should be on the tank taking the Mark of Chaos, so he will take it, and he always knows what to do with it. In terms of what he has to do with it in phase 1, that is just run away from the melee group and the range group and place it somewhere safe so it doesn't hit anyone. This is why we use warrior or a monk or a druid, which can all leap away or teleport away and get rid of the mark fast.
Some things to keep track in phase 1 is, first of all, remember that the Arcane Aberration knocks people backwards, so make sure you don't trigger a trap when that happens. And the second thing is that the orbs of chaos that will spawn from the tank with the Mark of Chaos, they're gonna be coming in the raid while there is a Force Nova. So make sure that you keep track of those balls and don't touch them while moving forward. Now, if you've done the things properly in phase 1, hopefully you still have all your combat reses, and once the boss hits 66.5%, he will instantly teleport and start channeling his new rune. You can still DPS him a bit before he goes immune, so do that, but make sure that your melee DPS are ready on the spot to DPS the War Mages as soon as they spawn. Now, as we said, the War Mages will be getting some stacks which increase their damage of their bolts if they get a successful cast going through. So to make sure that those bolts don't actually kill people in the raid, you want to have appropriate interrupt rotations. The buff lasts 5 seconds, and to make sure that you actually always reset it, you need to have at least 3 interrupts back to back for the buff to fall off. It's okay to let 1 cast go through in between the interrupt rotations, since it will only do minimal damage and it won't actually kill someone. Now, a smart idea is to actually split the DPS between the 2 War Mages, but put a little bit of emphasis into one, so that it actually dies faster, and then everyone can finish off the last one while having all the interrupts you can there.
Besides the War Mages, there's also going to be volatile anomalies spawning again from the boss. We'll just have the tanks pick them up and DPS them down, and no one else needs to help out. If needed, you can even spare one of the tanks to go on the War Mages, help out a bit of DPS there, and just have 2 tanks on the volatile anomalies. What we're doing here is leaving them up, doing minimal DPS to the ads, so at the end of the phase we can cool down the raid and blow them all up at the same time together with the boss. This will reduce the overall damage taken as we're reducing it to cooldowns, and it will also not require any DPS to go on the ads during this transition. Now, at the end of the intermission, the boss will come down again. He's still going to have the attack speed stacks from the first phase, so once the tanks try to pick the boss up, make sure you don't leave it on the same tank so he gets too many stacks.
So now phase 2 starts, and the boss will have the Rune of Displacement still, and he gets the Rune of Fortification this time. And what that means for the abilities is, starting with the Force Nova, it does the pushback, and it also comes in 3 waves every time the boss casts it. The Arcane Wraths still have the circle around you that you can't move out of, and every time it jumps to a new player, the distance reduction, the range of it, it gets reduced 50% less, so it's harder to get rid of it. The tank debuff, the Mark of Chaos, the tank will still get teleported to a random ranged player, and they will be rooted there for the duration of the debuff. The Arcane Aberrations, the adds, they have double the health than they normally have, and they still knock everyone back when they die. And lastly, the traps, they still grow bigger as time passes, and they actually last longer than normal.
Now for the execution of phase 2, as the raid is gathered up and you're AoEing the ads, the raid is going to stay there for a few seconds until the first Arcane Wrath gets put out. They are going to give them to 2 assigned players that will take care of it, and the movement of those will be explained a bit later. But once the first debuff is out, the raid, which is deranged, they will move to the area between the square and the circle. In this video you can see there's a gateway ready there, so once we get the first Mark of Chaos, they can click the gateway and fly all the way to the next position, which is going to be near the skull until we get traps. As you get these traps, you move slowly towards the cross. At the cross or near the cross, we're going to get our second Mark of Chaos, and then the raid will move towards the triangle. And then once we're at the triangle, we're going to get more traps, and we'll slowly keep moving clockwise. Once again, we're going to get one last Mark of Chaos, hopefully, and then we're going to move back to the start where we started off in the fight. Once you've made a full circle, hopefully the traps will have despawned, or they should if you follow our pattern. The traps from the start will be gone, so you can keep going and doing this forever until you finish this phase. And since the Berserk is not an issue, so don't worry about pushing the DPS. For the boss position, we're going to keep him in the middle of the room, and we move him away from where the Mark of Chaos goes, so the melee doesn't die from it too fast. And as always, keep the boss face towards the range, so when we get the Arcane Aberration spawning, they're going to be spawning in front of them and not away from them.
Yeah, it's really important to kill the Arcane Aberration as fast as possible, so make sure it's your priority target for the whole DPS as soon as it spawns, because the AoE damage that it does to the whole raid actually drains a lot of mana from the healers, and you wanna keep as much mana as you can for the last phase. Make sure you kill them instantly as soon as they spawn. Now for the Arcane Wrath, as Jospit said, you want to have 2 assigned players who will take it from the initial target and then jump it between themselves until it expires. Ideally you want those 2 players to be either 2 hunters or 1 hunter and the healer, and their job is to, as we said, take the Arcane Wrath from either the melee camp or the ranged camp and slowly move it away from the raid. And when it has reached either 63 yards jump range or 48 yards jump range, the player who has it obviously stays there and lets it expire on him, and the other player needs to move back into the ranged camp to outrange that jump. You can either move clockwise or counterclockwise away from the raid. It kind of depends where it spawns and how you can pick it up. But a good thing to keep in mind is having the boss a bit closer to the ranged camp right before the Arcane Wrath spawns, to make sure that if it spawns in the melee camp or the ranged camp, it doesn't really affect the placement of it that much. And once it has spawned, you can move the boss a little bit away from where the 2 players dealing with it want to let it expire on, to make sure that there's no melee DPS close enough to jump on him. Now in terms of every single Arcane Wrath, which you should be getting only 4 of in phase 2, you can check the written guides and there are pictures for each and every one of them and where we were moving to get rid of them. If it happens that you actually fail with Arcane Wrath and it jumps back in the raid, do not try to have those 2 players take it back and move out of the raid. Just let it jump between the raid and hopefully at some point it will disappear without killing too many people.
Now for the Force Novas in phase 2, as the ranged are grouped up the whole time, and they can be, when the Force Novas are happening you just move forward to avoid as much damage as you can. And for the melee you just get knocked back and then you run back to the boss. And the Arcane Aberrations this time, just have the 3rd tank handle them again. Just pick them up, focus on the ad, keep them on top of the boss and focus them down.
And if you keep doing this until the boss hits 33.5%, that's when the second intermission starts. The boss will teleport again and become immune to damage after a few seconds. So again, keep DPSing him. Try to squeeze in that little bit of DPS there to make the phase 3 last a bit less time. The second intermission is basically the same as the first intermission, except this time you have a Gorian Reaver, which basically means that you need more DPS to handle all of the ads than you do in the first intermission. That is why we advise to use your DPS potions here if you are struggling with this phase, because you do not want to enter phase 3 having either the War Mages or the Reaver up. Now one thing that we forgot to mention in phase 1 is that War Mages they cast an ability called Slow on a random target, which makes their cast and attack speed slower, and it should be dispelled, but actually a good idea is instead of casting Dispel, you can just have your paladins cast Hand of Freedom since it costs less mana, and it gets rid of the debuff.
While the DPS and the interrupters are focusing on the war mages, the tanks are going to have to handle the Reaver this time. He will apply a debuff to the tank, which reduces their armor, kick them back, which will reset their threat, and then there's also the little ads spawning from the boss itself. So what we did was have one tank assigned picking up the small ads and two tanks handling the Reaver. The first tank will pick up the Reaver and drag them next to the boss where the little ads are spawning, so we tank them on top of that and cleave them down as the tanks only. And then the first tank will get kicked back 20 to 25 seconds after he's gotten some stacks, and then he will swap to the second tank. Once that happens, the first tank goes back, builds up more aggro again, and then when the second kick happens, the Reaver will go back to the second tank again while the third tank is still handling the little ads. Now the hard part of the Reaver will be when the boss comes down. You're also going to have the volatile anomalies up while having the Reaver up and the boss up. The armor debuff is still applied to one of the tanks, or even both if the swap just happened. So what you want to do is, as the raid AoEs down the volatile anomalies, you're going to have the third tank taunt the Reaver, so the first two tanks can go back to focusing on the boss. Now when the Reaver kicks the third tank, he will swap back to one of the tanks, and they need to make sure to face it away from the raid. As the knockback happens, they will want to get knocked towards the wall, the whole face, and he also does a frontal cone cleave, sort of. A cone that does a lot of damage, and you don't want to hit the raid or any other tanks hit by that.
Now of course, if the DPS is good throughout the whole second intermission, the Reaver should not be up for too long into phase 3. So once the boss is down, you should have the whole raid focusing on the Reaver if everything goes according to plan, and it should die within 20 seconds maximum. So it's not gonna impact the phase 3 too much. And once phase 3 starts, the boss will get the rune of replication and the rune of fortification. So again, going quickly through all the abilities, what that means for them. For the Force Nova, there will be 3 waves of them coming every time he casts it, and there will be explosions every time you pass through them. The Arcane Wraths, there is no more circle anymore, so you can finally freely move around with it, but it jumps to 2 players and the distance is still being reduced slower, so you can't get rid of them fast. Now the tank debuff, Arc of Chaos, the tank will be frozen as soon as the cast is finished, and when the debuff expires, there will be Orbs of Chaos flying throughout the whole room. The Arcane Aberrations, the ads, they still have double the health, and when they die, they will spawn the Arcane Remnants once again. And lastly, the traps, when they expire, they will duplicate themselves, they will spawn 2 new ones, and they last for longer duration.
And that brings us to the execution of phase 3, the last phase for Margok. As the raid ends this phase, you're going to want to move towards boss and the Reaver and the little ads before you start AoEing it down, and then once you're all gathered up, you blow them up basically, and then you finish the Reaver. The raid will be basically at the diamond from that point on. Once the Reaver dies, you move boss a little bit towards the middle and the range stays at diamond. Keep reminding the tanks to always face the boss towards the range, for when the ad spawns, it'll be closer to them. Now, once they get traps spawned on top of them, the raid is not going to be moving counterclockwise this time, but they're going to move clockwise. So from the diamond, they're going to move towards the triangle, and they keep moving this way until the end of this phase.
The first thing that the boss will cast in phase 3, just like in phase 2 and 1, is an Arcane Wrath. And the first one is kind of special. We're gonna deal with it in a different way than the rest of them. As we said, the whole raid is gonna be gathered up at that point, and you wanna have 4 players assigned who will take the debuff from the raid camp and move it to the green mark, and let it bounce between those 4 players. Once it has reached 48 yards range, the 2 players who have it at that point are gonna be moving to the left towards, let's say, the entrance of the room, and get rid of it in one of those corners, while the 2 other players will be moving back to the ranged camp. After the first Arcane Wrath has been dealt with, the rest of them in phase 3, no matter who gets it, needs to move into the melee camp and let it bounce between the melee DPSers. And once it has reached 48 yards, well, you can't do it on 63 yards, but it's safer to wait for the 48 yards jump range. You want it to jump onto either a Windwalker Monk or a Rogue, and the 2 players who get that either sprint away or use the flying kick to fly all the way to the blue mark, as far away as possible from the raid, and let it drop off there. And that's how you handle the Arcane Wraths in this phase. Now in terms of the Force Nova, because it comes in 3 waves and it has the explosions, it means that the ranged can no longer be gathered up throughout this whole phase. So you want to split up and have a decent spread so that when the Force Novas are coming through, you don't explode to the people next to you. Obviously you can still use the blinks to go through them, but because there will be so many of them, you can't use it every single time.
Now for the melee and the Force Novas, as a melee you're going to want to move out every time it's about to pulse. So the first time you can see the cast, you're going to run out, and then as soon as the wave is moving you can move back in, but make sure you do not stand on top of other melee, so warriors charge in, rogues shadow step or cloak it, and monks roll. Now when the second boss comes, you're not going to see it cast, so it's advised to either look at your boss mod when the next wave is coming and move out 2 seconds before again, and do the same for the last wave. Now the Mark of Chaos that's going to happen on the tanks, it's really going to be important, because as the tank gets rooted and is going to shoot orbs, they cannot move, and if they get stuck in the middle of the room, the raid is going to be screwed. Therefore we're going to use a warrior tank in our kill. You can also use a monk that can teleport away, or a druid, as we said at the start of this video, that can blink away fast as the cast is happening. When the boss starts casting Mark of Chaos, the warrior or the monk or the druid is going to want to run away towards the blue side of the room, and they're going to leap or teleport there so they have enough distance from the melee and they don't have to move away from the middle, and they can keep the boss there. Because it's important, the Mark of Chaos will always go to the warrior or the monk, or the druid in some cases. You're gonna want to make sure that you do one more swap at around just under 8 seconds. The boss will not teleport to the tank that gets the mark, so it's not going to reset aggro, and the off tank is going to have to taunt the boss back from him. And since taunt cooldowns have 8 seconds, you're gonna want to tank swap around 8 to 6 seconds, so they always have the taunt ready, so the boss doesn't follow the tank that's running away with the mark.
Now the arcane aberrations in this phase, because you already have the Force Novas triple and doing all of the exploding damage, they're gonna add into that, and it's gonna mean that throughout phase 3 there's tons of AoE damage throughout the whole raid. That is why it is even more crucial than the other phases to DPS them down as fast as possible. It's advised to even use some DPS cooldowns when they spawn, just to kill them even 2 seconds faster, because it makes a big difference for the healers. And once they're dead, they will spawn the arcane remnants, the small lads, which the third tank will be picking up. Ideally, you want to have a mass grip, so that they're instantly all gathered up underneath the boss, and you cleave them down as fast as possible, because the tanks are still taking all the damage from the Force Novas in this phase, combined with the arcane remnants and the boss damage, it might kill them.
Yeah, using stuns on these little ads when the Force Novas are happening is really advised, because 1, it'll keep them on top of the boss and cleaving will be better then, and 2, it will reduce the tank damage while the Force Novas are happening.
Now last thing to keep in mind is that the traps that spawn throughout this whole phase, because they duplicate, if you don't spawn them in proper positions, you might actually run out of room. Because keep in mind, you want to have the blue mark area free for the arcane rats and the marks of chaos to be dealt with there. What you can do is, obviously you can't spawn good traps, and what I mean by good traps is spawn them close to previous existing ones so that they're all gathered up. Now you can't do that during the Force Novas. But when you can't do that is when there are no Force Novas and there is only an arcane aberration ad. So yeah, make sure you pay attention to the timer and spawn them in proper positions and then spread out again. Really helps with having enough room to spread out throughout the whole phase.
Now once Margok reaches 5%, this is when the next intermission phase, it's a transition from Margok to cho'gall, which is going to be the extra boss in this fight and this phase, which is phase 4. At 5%, Night Twisted Faithfuls will start spawning from all sides of the room, and you're gonna want to gather them up and AoE them at the entrance. It might happen that some abilities are still happening, because the boss keeps casting and doing what he was doing for 10 more seconds after he reaches the transition percentage. So if the tank gets a Mark of Chaos, he's still going to be stuck in place and shoot out orbs. If Force Novas are happening, those are still going to go off. And if you get a debuff, you're still going to want to deal with the debuff. Same goes with an Arcane Aberration. If it spawns, you're gonna have to kill it and the ads that spawn from it.
Now keep in mind, any DPS that you do on Margok after 5% is completely wasted, because cho'gall is gonna come up and suck the life out of him, no matter if he is at 1% or 4.9%. So what you need to do is keep your positions and stay calm, and once all of the Night Twisted Faithfuls, and in case you have any Arcane Aberration or Arcane Remnants, They're all gathered up, and once Margok is placed into his little bubble and he stops casting and DPSing the tanks, the tank who has all those adds needs to move to the entrance, meaning the circle mark, and that's where you're gonna do all the AoE and kill all of those adds there. Throughout this whole time, cho'gall will come in the room, but will actually not do anything for 30 seconds or so you don't have to worry about him. Just make sure that you are done with all of the adds, and you're ready to DPS him the second he comes active.
These Night Twisted Faithfuls will leave behind a pool of dark, bubbly ground stuff that will damage you if you stand in it. So that's why we're killing it at the entrance, so it's not going to have any effect on our movement afterwards.
Yeah, these pools, which are called Growing Shadows, they stay there for the whole Phase 4. That is why you need to make some room management and kill them in corners or places where they're not going to affect your movement. Now once you've AoE'd the first wave of the Night Twisted Faithfuls, which is actually a lot of them, there's 25 of them, and around 10 seconds or so before cho'gall becomes active, there will be a new wave of Night Twisted Faithfuls coming from the two sides of the room, but this time there will only be 10 of them. Now you do not want to start DPSing them instantly. Instead, you want to just off-tank them somewhere away from the raid and be ready to instantly DPS cho'gall, so ignore them for the time being. Now, finally, once cho'gall becomes active, he has some new abilities. If you're an old school player and you've killed him in the Bastion of Twilight, that's not going to help you here. He doesn't know those abilities quite yet. The first and the most important ability in Phase 4 are the Glimpses of Madness. cho'gall will target a random player, and it can be anyone, even the tanks, and he will spawn a glimpse, a copy of that player, in front of where they are standing at that time. Once that glimpse has spawned, it will cast the same ability over and over again, called Gaze of the Abyss. The single target nuke Shadow Bolt to the closest target of that Glimpse of Madness. And every time it's cast on him, it will give him a stack that increases the damage of that ability. So target will get increased damage the more stacks he gets. Second ability is the Enveloping Night, which the boss will cast every minute, and depending on how many Glimpses of Madness are up, when the boss casts Enveloping Night, each one of them, each of the glimpses, will cast an AoE nuke to the whole raid for 100k damage. So as the fight progresses, the Enveloping Nights will do more and more damage to the raid. And that's basically the softened raids of the boss. Now, to counter this ability, the boss also does a debuff called Infinite Darkness to 3 players in the raid. And what that debuff does is absorb all healing done to those targets until it is dispelled. And once it is dispelled, all the healing that it has absorbed is spread out as an absorbed damage shield to the whole raid. The last ability that cho'gall casts is Dark Star, which is basically a purple bomb that spawns above the head of a random player in the raid. And after 5 seconds, it explodes and does massive damage to anyone who is 25 yards close to it.
Now all these new abilities and them not being mentioned in the dungeon journal might make this fight seem, or phase rather, seem pretty intimidating, but it's really not. If you follow the pattern we've done, it's going to be quite an easy phase, and if the soakers, the people that will take care of the glimpses, and the healers do their job, it's going to be dying really fast. As the boss becomes active on the circle mark, you're going to want to drag him towards the square mark, but not all the way to the square. You're going to want to stop in between the square and the circle mark. So about halfway between those marks, you're going to stand still with the boss, and the whole raid is going to be standing on top of it, with the only exception being the tank having the Night Twisted Faithfuls. Once you get to that position, you're going to want to use Bloodlust because of the soften rates this fight has, and because you want to kill the boss before the third big AoE that happens, you're going to need Bloodlust to make it. Now once you've arrived between the circle and the square on this position, and there's an image in the written guide which you can look at for the exact movements in this fight that I'm going to talk about right now, you're going to stand on this first position until you get the first glimpse spawning. You'll see the boss cast Glimpse of Madness, and this is your sign. As soon as this happens, you're going to move the boss towards the exact middle of the room. We're doing this because Dark Star is about to happen. As Dark Star does, it's going to spawn on one random raid member, and after about 5 seconds it's going to blow up and deal damage around it. So once we get to the middle, we wait for the Dark Star to spawn, and once it spawns, we're going to move towards the circle diamond. Now it might happen that we just AoE the ads near the circle, so there might be growing shadows on the ground. So you just move a little bit closer towards the triangle if that happens, and this is where we're going to AoE. We should have gotten our second wave of Night Twisted Faithfuls at this point, so we're going to AoE 2 waves on top of each other. And once that is done, we're going to stand here until we get our second Glimpse of Madness. Once the second glimpse spawns, you're going to move towards the green, and this is where you're going to wait for the third glimpse. Once the third glimpse spawns, you're going to move to the middle again, because Dark Star is about to happen. Once the Dark Star happens, you're going to move towards the cross, and this is where we are going to AoE for the second time. We have gotten 2 new waves since the last time we AoE'd, so we're going to AoE 2 waves of Night Twisted Faithfuls together with the boss on top of the cross. After we're done AoEing, we're going to move to the skull, and this will be where we're going to wait for our 5th and hopefully last Glimpse of Madness. Once we get this 5th glimpse, we're going to move to the middle where we're going to get our last Dark Star. Once this one happens, just avoid wherever it is and finish the boss, because at this point the boss is going to be really low and you're not going to kill anything else anymore.
Yeah, at this point the fight becomes kind of too messy to handle all of the glimpses, so you kind of have to just YOLO it. The good news is that the mechanics of the fight, they don't actually wipe your raid too fast, apart from the enveloping night, which you shouldn't get the third one off. So you can just move the boss wherever the Dark Star isn't and finish him off, because hopefully he will be very low at that point. Now, something to note is that since there is no tank debuff in phase 4, you only need 1 tank throughout the whole phase tanking cho'gall. The other 2 tanks can gather up the Night Twisted Faithfuls, so you can have one of them picking the ones spawning from one side and the other tank picking the ones from the other side, and it's going to minimize the damage that they take. Now, one thing we didn't mention is that the Night Twisted Faithfuls have an ability called Dark Frenzy, which basically means the longer they stay alive, the more movement and attack speed they gain. And that is why you need to actually AoE them down at some point, because they start by doing very little damage. Now, because they actually don't do too much damage, that is why we can wait for a second wave of them spawning, and since we have 2 tanks tanking them, we can afford to AoE them down every second wave. So as you can see, it's not very complicated dealing with these adds. The one thing that is actually complicated and can get out of hand are the Glimpses of Madness. So as we said, we're gonna have at least 5 Glimpses of Madness spawning in this phase, and that's pretty much as many as you can get and handle reliably. So you want to have 5 predetermined groups of 2 people soaking each of those glimpses. Ideally, you want to have 1 ranged DPS and 1 healer in each of those groups. So the Glimpse of Madness are going to be casting those Gaze of the Abyss every 5 seconds, and it will leave that debuff for 15 seconds on that target. You can go as high as 4 or 5 stacks of the Gaze of the Abyss before it starts one-shotting you. Once the first soaker reaches those stacks, he needs to move away and let the second player in the group be the closest target and start soaking those debuffs. Now, once that debuff expires on the initial soaker, it will do a 300k AoE explosion 8 yards around him, including himself. So you need to make sure that you're not standing anywhere close to other players in the raid, and also use a personal survivability cooldown to survive that burst of damage. Once that has happened, you just rinse and repeat until the boss dies. Just make sure you don't forget about your partner and keep swapping at around 4 to 5 stacks.
And the last 2 abilities that cho'gall is still doing in this phase are Enveloping Night, that's the AoE from the glimpses, which gets increased for each glimpse that is in the room. So at the start, the first one will happen with 2 glimpses, and the second one will happen when there is 4 glimpses, and the third one is going to happen when you have 6 glimpses, but hopefully the boss is dead before that, because we're not planning for that one. Now, when the phase starts, cho'gall will cast Infinite Darkness on 3 different members in the raid. This is going to be the debuff that soaks up all the healing, and once dispelled, splits up all that healing done into the shield and makes it an absorb on the whole raid for the amount. Plan here is to have 2 available Infinite Darknesses, 1 for the first Enveloping Night and 1 for the second Enveloping Night, which will be healed up as much as possible, as much as the healers can spare, besides healing the people taking Glimpse of Madness and the tanks. Perfect targets for this are obviously the melee, because they're just going to be sitting on the boss and not take any damage. It might happen that an Infinite Darkness goes on a target that needs to soak Glimpse of Madness. In that case, you just have to dispel them, and hopefully you have 2 more left. If it doesn't happen that you have 2 more left, he's going to cast Infinite Darkness again later in the fight, but it'll just make the second Enveloping Night do a little bit more damage outside of the absorb shields you're going to have, because there was less time to heal that shield up. The best way to take care of this is to have 1 healer assigned to dispelling and no one else dispels anything. So that 1 person does this job and everyone else can just focus on soaking their gazes and healing the raid or the debuffs.
Just make sure if you're a rogue, you don't accidentally cloak that debuff, because that can mess up everything.
Alright, so I know that we've been talking for a long time and it's going to be hard to remember all of the things that we said, but keep these few things in mind and the rest you can see how they work out when you're actually doing the fight. First of all, don't blow the traps. Specifically, look out for when the arcane aberrations are dying and they knock you back. Be careful that you're not standing in front of one of the traps. Second, the arcane aberrations need to die ASAP. They are the main source of damage throughout the whole fight, so as soon as one spawns, target it, kill it, then go back to the boss. Because of how much damage these arcane aberrations do, you do not want to have an intermission start while there is still an arcane aberration up. So make sure that you see the timers properly and don't push the boss too fast in an intermission before you've cleared out all the adds.
Now once you're into the intermissions properly and without any adds up, you're gonna want to use your DPS cooldowns in these phases, because these are the DPS checks of this fight. The other phases are not that hard on the DPS, and you can always do one more rotation, like have one extra Force Nova or an extra add and finish those before you go into the intermission, because the Berserk is not a problem. You also want to keep in mind that you want to have a rotation for the War Mages, an interrupt rotation, because you don't want them to get too many stacks of the buff they get.
Now, as we said, the arcane aberrations deal the most damage throughout the whole fight to the whole raid, but close second are the Force Novas. The good thing is that the Force Novas, there are ways to minimize the damage taken from them, and you should use them. So use your blinks, your disengages, your immunities, use them there and minimize basically all the damage you can. Now once you reach cho'gall in phase 4, the main thing to look out for are the glimpses. You want to spawn them in proper locations, not too close to each other, because that will mess it up, and you're gonna need to have people AFKing right next to them, and they won't be able to reach the raid or the boss. Spawn them properly and control the gaze of the abysses, the debuffs, when they run out and the explosions that they do, and that you swap between the two people properly, not go too high up on the stacks.
And one more important task that needs to be kept in mind at all times in that last phase is the Infinite Darkness dispelling by the healers that are going to be doing that. And of course, keep healing those targets so you get enough absorb shields to survive the enveloping nights. Now let's look at some tips and tricks, and let's start with phase 4 because we just talked about it. First of all, you can stun the Night Twisted Fatefuls in phase 4 to either reduce damage, or you should stun them when they're about to die. So the black growing shadows doesn't kill any melee people that might be standing near them while AoEing. Also, the people soaking glimpses, they can try to take a position closer to the boss or away from their glimpses, because if the new glimpse spawns and it's on top of them, it might end up on their previous glimpse, and if you move closer to the boss, it won't be. So there's more space and room for this next group to soak it.
Yeah, basically keep track of the timer from your bigwigs or whatever boss mod you're using add-on, and when you see the new glimpse about to spawn, you can just move away from your glimpse that you're soaking right then. And keep in mind that you don't have to be actually close to the glimpse that you're soaking, you just need to be the closest target. So if you don't see anyone else being close, then you can move freely. Going back to the first 3 phases, and specifically for the intermissions, because those are the most crucial parts of the fight, if you happen to get an Arcane Wrath debuff right before an intermission phase starts, because as we said, that might happen if you're trying to push the boss and he gets a cast off 1 second before he drops to the percent that he goes into the intermission, you might end up with a fresh Arcane Wrath. At that point, you need to not panic and slowly get it away from the raid, because you still have the circle around you preventing you from moving too far away. So slowly move it on one of the sides, either the right side or the left side, and jump it in the 2 people that are usually doing it. But instead of getting rid of it early, you can just wait a couple more jumps and then move away from the last person who soaks it. And lastly, the last tip is for the interrupts in the intermissions. The War Mages, as we said many times before, they need to be interrupted. Things can go wrong. People might fall asleep. They might forget to interrupt. So a very useful tool to keep track of all the interrupts and realize when someone has either failed their interrupt or used it at the wrong time is to have Weak Aura or some other add-on that tracks abilities from other players casted. You can basically see how the rotation is going by tracking those things. We will have a link for an example in the description, but you obviously need to adjust it to whatever classes and whatever spells are being used for the interrupts.
And that brings us to the end of our last Highmaul Mythic video guide for Margok. We hope everything's been useful and you can get this boss down fast.
And if you can't get it down right now, don't be disheartened, because as we all know, Blackrock Foundry is coming up, so you can go and get your tier bonuses and extra gear and come back to finish the job. Now, if you have any trouble with the Blackrock Foundry bosses, of course, we will be making Mythic video guides for those bosses as well, so if you want to know as soon as they are up, subscribe to our channel, and good luck, guys!
We'll see you after Foundry.